Thank you very much. I'm happy to be with you today, and I'm willing to bet you that I've learned more from you than you're going to learn from me. But I will tell you some little parts of my story. I think it ties in with what you've been talking about in terms of, particularly in terms of vision. I think that I was in a situation where I was already working for a large corporation, which was MetLife, and I was looking for opportunities to create something new. And I started to pay more attention to what happens outside the United States than what happens inside the United States. I have to tell you that at the time, MetLife's business was all in the United States. And while it was a good business, I thought there were a lot more opportunities to grow it outside than inside. So I just started doing some research on publicly available information, so nothing that was secret or anything like that. And one of the things you find out when you start doing research on other countries is you find out the growth rates of the countries. Almost every country in the world, with a few exceptions like Japan and some of the countries in Western Europe, almost every country in the world is growing faster than the United States. Almost every country's GDP, their gross domestic product, is growing faster. And almost every country has a lower penetration of insurance than the United States. When I say penetration of insurance, what do I mean? What I mean is, what percentage of the GDP, is just the total of the goods and services that are produced each year in the country, right? So what percentage of the GDP is spent on insurance? In the US, you can look at different numbers, but it would be probably 7 to 9%. Same thing for a country like England. But if you look at a country like Mexico, just as one example, you would see that less than 1% of the GDP of that country is spent on insurance. So what does that mean? It means there's a tremendous amount of room to grow. And as I did this research, I ran across I guess probably more of a joke than a story. It's a joke about a president of a company, and he sells shoes. His company sells shoes. And so he gets this man that works for the company. He says, I want you to go out to this island. I want you to do a study of the market. And I want you to come back and give me a report about that market. And so the man goes out and he comes back with a report. It's a nice long report. It has lots of facts and statistics and figures. But basically what the report says, in a nutshell, is this is a terrible market. Nobody here wears shoes on this island. So the president is not very happy with that report. He's not sure about that, so he gets a woman and gives her the same assignment. He sends her out to the island, and he says, I want to report. She comes back and reports lots of facts and statistics and charts and graphs, and it looks very nice. But in a nutshell, what it says is, this is a great market. Nobody here wears shoes. Okay. The point being that if you have something to sell, whatever the something is, it could be insurance, it could be shoes, it could be chocolates, it could be anything. If nobody in a particular market, or very few people in a particular market are using that, you can view that in two ways. You can say it's hopeless, or you can say this is a huge opportunity. So I took the point of view that this is a huge opportunity. Let's go try it out. Let's see if we can sell insurance in Mexico, or we can sell insurance in India, or we can sell insurance in China. And I'm not saying there was no insurance there. There was some, but it was very, very little. So what we did over a period of time, and I say we because over time you have to put together a team, right? You've got to put together a group of people to do this, and it involves people, certainly in countries that you're targeting. You're not going to do business in China with a bunch of Americans. You're going to do mostly, you're going to do business with Chinese people. You're not going to do business in India with a bunch of Americans. You're going to do business with people from that country. So we put together some teams, not very big ones, but over time they grew. And we went from, basically from zero, we were not making any money outside the United States, over a period of 10 years to where we were making, after taxes, in excess of $2.25 billion. So the opportunity clearly was there, and you had to build on that opportunity. Now, a couple of things I would say about that. One is, so vision, I think, is the most important to me. I looked at the list, and I certainly agree with the things that are on the list. But if you don't have that vision, if you don't see the opportunity, then there's not much that you can do. Once you see the opportunity, once you grasp the opportunity, then I think a very important part of building a new business is, I'll call it persuasion. In other words, no matter who you are, well, I shouldn't say that, because I guess if you're already a billionaire, maybe that would be different. But since I wasn't a billionaire when I was starting, no matter who you are, you're going to need other people to sign on to your vision. You're going to need other people to say, I see the opportunity, persuade me of the opportunity, I'm willing to work in that business, I'm willing to put my sweat into that business, or I'm willing to invest in that business, because you aren't going to be able to grow a business of any size unless you get people who are going to back you. And in order to get them to back you, you have to persuade them to do that. And I think you do that through, you certainly do it through, the regular things you would think about, hard work and research and develop the facts. But I agree with the gentleman in the film who said they're really not buying the idea so much as they're buying you. So, are you able, do you have the self-confidence to persuade people basically to follow you? And they're either following you by working with you, right? Or they're following you by putting their money. Maybe you find people who are investors. It could be individuals, it could be people who want to buy shares in your company, it could be people who could be bankers. It doesn't matter who it is. Ultimately, they're going to have to be convinced that not only do you have a good idea, but maybe equally important with that you can execute on that idea. Because I hate to tell you this, and you probably know it already, there are lots of good ideas out there. There are lots of good ideas. But taking a good idea and turning it into a money-making proposition, that's a lot harder. Otherwise we have a lot more successful people in this world if everybody who just had a good idea was able to turn that into money. It doesn't quite work that way. And in the course of executing on that idea, all of those things on the list start to get really important, like persistence, right? Perseverance. Why? Because you will fail, right? Unless there's somebody in the room, I'm assuming everybody in the room is a human being, right? As I am. I failed many times along the way, many times, right? You get an idea, you try something, it doesn't work. What do you do when things don't work? Well, the first thing I think you have to do is you've got to go back and look at the basic idea and the execution of the idea. Sometimes I think people throw out ideas too fast. In other words, they run into a problem and they say, oh, that was a dumb idea to begin with. Not necessarily. Not necessarily. necessarily. Maybe it's a good idea, but maybe there are some pieces that are missing. Maybe you need a particular thing to make that idea come true, and you don't have it. Or maybe you've got some of the wrong people that are engaged in that idea. Even if you've got a small team, it's pretty clear over a period of time that people's capacities to do a job change, right? And also jobs change. So think about some of our most successful companies that were created from the ground up. A lot of these companies, the person who has the original idea, the person who gets the thing going, the person who starts the thing, isn't always the person who can manage it when it gets to be a company of 100,000 employees. Right? It takes a different skill or different skills. And there are lots of different steps along the way. So one of the things that you do have to focus on is being a keen judge of people, right? And being willing to take the actions on people that you need to take. Meaning, if you have somebody that's really good at starting up a company in a particular country or a particular part of a country, and the company is doing well, but all of a sudden you see that the company hits a plateau. Maybe your sales have been going like this, and all of a sudden sales plateau. And for 1 quarter, 2 quarters, 3 quarters, your sales are flat. Something is wrong. And maybe, I'm not saying it always is, but maybe something is the people that are running that particular company or that particular sales division. You have to stay close to your business in order to know them as it gets bigger. And I'll give you an example. A couple of years ago, I got a phone call. I answered the phone, and this person at the other end of the phone is screaming at me. I mean, screaming at me, calling me all sorts of names, curse words, you name it. He's really angry. Doesn't even, by the way, doesn't even say who he is. Now, I happen to recognize his voice because he's one of my competitors. Right? And so I said, will you calm down, after a while. Tell me what's bothering you. You know what you did. You're trying to put me out of business. He's yelling and screaming. So I said, look, obviously I can't talk to you. I'll figure it out. When I figure it out, I'm going to call you back. So I hang up. You know what this was? This was a situation where this man ran a huge company. I'm talking huge, even bigger than my company. Okay? And he was so focused on that business, on every part of that business, he knew something that was going on in Korea, right, between his company and my company, and Korea for him was probably less than 2% of his company. Right? So you've got to say to yourself, here's this guy, he's running a huge financial empire, and yet he's calling to yell at a competitor about something that happened in a market that's less than 2% of his business. What does that tell you? Now, I mean, it can tell you a lot of things, right? You can say, oh, I'm mad at that guy because he called up and yelled at me. Actually, I respected him for doing it, right? I mean, I didn't necessarily feel like he did it the right way. But what I respected was, here's a guy who's running this huge company, thousands and thousands of employees, and he knows what's going on in some little corner of his world, of his market, and he knows that somebody else is doing something competitively that he doesn't like, and he's going to act on it. To me, I thought to myself, I got to admire that. I got to admire a guy who's going to, you talked about Mayor Koch.
Right.
One of the things about Mayor Koch was, he always, you didn't necessarily have to agree with him, or maybe you did, maybe you didn't, but he always stood up for New York, right? He never took any shit from anybody about New York, right? Whenever anybody said anything, he was right there. He was good. Well, this guy was the same way, right? This guy was running a huge business. First of all, he knew the details, and that I had to respect that, right? Here's a guy who knows his business. By the way, there's a flip side of that, which is micromanaging, which can get you into a lot of trouble too. But I think in this case, the fact that he knew what was going on and the fact that he was going to stand up for his business meant a lot to me as a competitor. So I think that as you grow your business, things are going to change. And one of the things you have to remember is it's not always going to be the same as it was at the beginning. And it may be that you need to do different things, that you need to adapt, that you need to learn new things, both about the marketplace, but also about your own company, that's going to put you in a better position to not only build the business, but to continue to be successful, to continue to make it bigger and bigger. The other aspect of this is you, as I said before, you will fail. There will be times when you don't succeed. And then you have to make your own analysis of what's wrong. And you have to figure out those people that you can trust. Because I don't think building a business, even if you're the person at the center of it, even if you're the entrepreneur, even if you're the one who came up with the ideas, the world has gotten sufficiently complicated so that nobody can do a successful business of any size and scope without some people they rely on, right? Without people that they trust. And so the judgment about those people and the selection of those people and making sure that those people are in the right spots, right? Because, as I said before, somebody who's in the right spot on day one, on day 10,000, may not be in the right spot. Doesn't mean, by the way, and don't get me wrong, it doesn't mean, by the way, that people have to be fired. Usually what I find is that if you've got people in the wrong space, there's a better space for them, right? There's something else that they can do that's going to contribute to the success of that business. So it doesn't necessarily, the only time I've really had major parting of the ways with people personally is when it came down to a question of integrity or honesty. You can't afford somebody in your business that's going to, what I used to tell people is, the only thing we can't tolerate is people who are going to damage the reputation of the company. Anything else you can tolerate pretty much. You tolerate people who have crazy ideas every day. One of those crazy ideas probably will work. You just have to figure out which ones. But when it comes to honesty and integrity, that's a place where you have to draw the line. The other thing I would say to you is, as you do this, the main things to look for, at least from my perspective, are finding places, as I said before, where there's open territory, right? Where there's something that's needed, but also finding a way that people can pay for it, right? Because one of the interesting questions is, people need lots of things. You said people need credit. You're right, people do need credit. The problem is, sometimes the people who need credit the most have the least ability to pay it back. And therefore you've got to figure out a way that you can actually make it into a viable business proposition, that it's something that you can do. And by the way, in the area of credit, if you look around the world, especially in countries like Pakistan, for example, Pakistan is a very poor country. Bangladesh, another very poor country. What they developed in Bangladesh originally, and it's now spread to a number of different countries around the world, is microfinance, right? And you've probably read some about this and seen some about it, and it's an amazing thing because what they've done is they lend small amounts of money, very small amounts of money. I'm talking like $50, sometimes $25. But of course, the purchasing power of that $25 is a lot greater in Bangladesh than it is here in the U.S., right? And they lend, a lot of this lending is to women, and a lot of it is to women in small communities that have ideas for businesses. It could be weaving clothing, it could be setting up a small, grist mill to grind grain, whatever the business happens to be, and they form a group of people, a group of entrepreneurs in that particular market, and they lend the money and small amounts of money, and there's tremendous, I'll call it peer pressure, I guess, from the people in that group to pay back that money, right, as they have their businesses grow. And they have tremendous success rates. If you look at the, in finance we would call it default rate, right? It's the question of how many people are going to default on their loan, which means I lend you $1,000 and now comes time to pay back or start making the payments and you default, you don't pay back. The default rates on those loans for microfinance in countries like Bangladesh are among the lowest in the world. So think about that. You have really poor people. You don't have people, in most of these cases, they're not people who are educated, right? So they don't have any sort of, in many cases, any sort of formal schooling. They're setting up small, new businesses, and they're paying back their loans at a rate that's higher than what businesses in some mature countries, many mature countries, economically mature countries are paying back. So, in that case, they found a way, using not only the techniques of microfinance, but they're also using the psychological effects of nobody in that group wants to be the one who fails. Nobody wants to be the one who doesn't pay back. And so they honor their commitments and they pay back their loans. And of course, what that means is the more, as that business grows, the more you get people paying back the loans, the more you can lend, right? The more you can do. So I think you have to find not only where the opportunities are, but you also have to find the way in which you can make it a viable business for your customers and for yourself. I mean, obviously, you've got to make a reasonable profit, right? That's part of the game here. But it's not just finding an opportunity; it's finding one that you can execute on. So I think maybe I'll stop.
Yeah.
And you want to do questions?
Well, you should. Let's take a couple of questions.
Yep.
But the microfinance is a really great point, and I think everybody should take a look at that business model. A lot has been written about it. It's so spectacular. I'm glad that Bill brought that up today. These third world countries, you have women who are knitting hats and paying back money and they had no opportunity to work or to earn money, and these microfinance banks, I believe one of the fellows actually won a
prize.
a Nobel Prize in economics.
Right.
Putting together that.
I think he got the Peace Prize, actually.
Right. No, I think he did. There was a very big story. It's about 2-3 years ago. And then other microfinance companies came to America, and that's how you came up with Kickstarter and a lot of the other companies that are now being used today. How about a couple of questions for Bill?
Go ahead.
What was one of your biggest challenges that you had to overcome when venturing into a new market? Now, yeah. And my other question is there something outside the numbers that you paid attention to that let you believe that it will be a success?
Yeah. Okay. Two things. I'm going to answer the second one first. You definitely pay attention to more than numbers, right? There's an old saying which says, if you pay attention to people, the numbers will come. If you pay attention to numbers, the people will go. And I think that's generally true. In other words, you have to focus on your market, on who's your customer. And that's people. That's all about people. So you definitely have to focus. Now you do have to figure out a way to make it into a financially viable proposition. But the main things that you're looking at in a lot of these markets is, how much money do people have, right? And how do they use that money? How do they get that money? I'll give you a really good example. When we first started in Mexico, at that time, if a young Mexican generally wanted to buy a house, right? historically, they would borrow the money from a relative or a friend to build their house or to buy their house, their first house. They did not use banks for that purpose. They did not use financial institutions. They would go to, Uncle Joe and ask Uncle Joe, could I borrow money from you? Now, the interesting thing is, and you say, what does that have to do with insurance? Well, that started to change, and we kept watching the trends of where people are borrowing from family and friends, and that's declining. And then you watch the other trend where people are borrowing from banks, from financial institutions, and that's increasing. So what does that mean? Well, if you take a loan for $10,000, right, and you borrow it from your Uncle Joe for your house, and you die, and you don't have the $10,000, maybe Uncle Joe will let your family stay in that house. Maybe, because he's your uncle, right? He's your friend, he's your relative. If you borrow $10,000 from a bank and you die, and you're not, and therefore you can't pay back the loan, you think the bank's going to let your family stay in that house? They're not. They're going to repossess. They're going to foreclose the mortgage, and they're going to take back the house. So what we said to people was, when you take your loan, once you start borrowing money from a bank, you should put life insurance on that loan, right? Meaning, if you die, at least your family will have the money. In fact, on those mortgage insurance policies, the money gets paid directly to the bank, so your family ends up owning the house, right? So that's just one example. So that's one thing. In terms of challenges, there are lots of challenges. I would say the challenge is, number one, convincing people in the market that you have something that they really need. In other words, lots of times people need something, but they don't know they need it, right? They don't know they need it until until you explain it to them, right? And so educating people, convincing people in the markets, very difficult in a lot of these markets, because a lot of times people don't get it, and it takes a while to do it. The other thing that I think is a big challenge is persuading backers. In other words, persuading people, because if you say, I'm going to go off and sell insurance in Bangladesh, you're going to get a lot of people who are very skeptical about that. And you're going to have to do a lot of convincing to get them to support you. So those are challenges. And then whenever you work outside the United States, and I've worked in 60 countries outside the United States, the cultural differences are enormous. So one of the things you have to do, you have to be very sensitive to the fact that you are doing business in their country. It's not your country, it's their country. And they have their own culture, they have their own, views of what's appropriate, what's not appropriate. They have their own laws, and so you have to figure out, how am I going to do business in this particular country? And it's not an easy thing. And you do have to be you have to be willing to learn. In other words, you can't go there, because the first thing they hate in many countries is, and everybody hates it. If I walk in here today and I say, look, folks, I have all the answers, right? You just listen to me. I'll tell you exactly what you're going to resent that, right? You're going to say, who the hell is he? It's the same thing in these countries. They're not interested in some American coming and telling them, this is the answer to all your problems. You have to figure out, how are you going to work inside their country, and it is challenging.